Hello everyone, in this video I'll be doing a tier list of the best damage types in Baldur's Gate 3. So knowing which of these damage types to use can actually help out with playing through the whole game, because in certain acts there's going to be different damage types that are more effective, and I'm going to be breaking that all down in this tier list. So first things first, we got poison. Now this is the most resisted damage type, and you can literally get a poison resist right at the start of the game. If you choose a certain race, you can just negate poison damage. There's also a ton of items that will give you resistances to poison, and you can even get a transmuter stone from a wizard that'll give you resistances. There's level 2 spells. This is probably the worst damage type. However, there are some things propping it up. There's a lot of items that can give you benefits if you poison a creature. Even still, I would say this is probably a D tier damage type. You can build around poison, but really, why would you? There's much better damage types to build around if you want to focus on one specific damage type. So poison is going into the D tier. Next we have force, and force is the least resisted. So force is obviously a great damage type. There's not many things that will resist force damage. The only ones that I can think of is Gortosh in Act 3. He does have a force resistance, but I don't think there's many others. Now, certain spells like Magic Missile, which are a common usage of force damage, you can block them with shield. However, Eldritch Blast is probably one of the best spells in the game. Force is also good because let's say you have a wall that you're trying to break down and your martial classes don't have weapons that can break it down. Let's say you all got sword users. Eldritch Blast, boom, boom, boom. You can break the wall down. So force is definitely S tier for a damage type. And there's actually a specific crossbow that deals purely force damage that you can get. So the Near Misser is a force only damage crossbow. And it also gives you a free level 3 cast of Magic Missile. And Magic Missile is great because sometimes you just can't hit a target. They're hidden behind a wall. This can curve around windows and hit the target. So force is definitely an S tier damage type overall, the least resisted. Next, we got Radiant. There's a lot of false information about Radiant damage everywhere on the internet. Now, Radiant damage does not... Undead are not vulnerable to Radiant damage. There's so many articles I read when I was researching damage types throughout this game that said Radiant damage is doubled on Undead and Fiends. That is not true. However, Divine Smite will give you an extra damage die, and I think that's where a lot of the misinformation is coming from. Now, there's only one damage type in this entire game that can be reflected, and that is Radiant damage. So if you're in a certain Act 3 fight, you can... I had my entire party wiped because my Paladin went in with a Divine Smite, and it reflected the damage and took me out. So... yeah, radiant damage is great though because there's, similar to poison, there's a lot of items that you can build around, like radiating orbs. So yeah, radiant damage, despite being, you need to know when to use it. Again, don't put all your eggs in one basket with the damage type. It's good to have a spread of a few of them, and I'll give my thoughts on which of the best are near the end of this video. But radiant damage overall has some really great builds. And overall, I do think that Radiant damage is probably an A tier damage type because of all the different items that you can get that benefit from it. And you can get some armor types in the first act that will benefit greatly from Radiant damage. So it's a good thing to build around, honestly. And while it is not double damage on Undead, using Smite, which is probably one of the most common usage of Radiant damage outside of Cleric and Druid spells, it's pretty good damage overall. So yeah, A tier. Next we got Thunder, and this one is kind of strange because it's a not very resisted damage type, but this is my experience with it, and I'm curious if anyone else in the comments can chime up. But anytime you use thunder damage, I find that the AI kind of outsmarts that, and they cast Silence. And Silence not only stops you from being able to cast spells, but Silence also negates all thunder damage. So you're out of luck. There are some really great thunder damage spells in the game, like Destructive Wave, which you get as being a cleric. So it is a good damage type overall, but Silence really does nerf it. And I feel like if Silence didn't exist, it would be up there with the force damage. But because you can get really nerfed really easily, I'm going to put it into the B tier because Silence is... with Radiant damage, you know which encounters are going to reflect your Radiant damage. Just don't use it then. With Thunder, anyone can cast Silence. It's hard to negate that, so I want to put that in the B tier. Next, we got Cold damage. Now, Cold and lightning, I believe, are two of the best in the game because of a certain mechanic that's very great to use and very easy with create water. So if targets are wet, they take double damage from cold damage and lightning. Fire is halved on those that have create water, so you can set up a build around these two in particular. And there's a few great classes for this. There's the Tempest Cleric, which I think is the best cleric type, and it focuses on lightning. There's also the Storm Sorcerer and the Draconic Bloodline Sorcerer. I enjoy both those. Sorcerer is my favorite class in general. That's why I talk a lot about this damage type. But overall, these are probably the two best because you can set up a vulnerability to it, making it better than Force. If you could make a vulnerability to Force, then Force would obviously be good. But whenever you can set up double damage on a damage type, that's incredible. So cold damage, I guess we'll start with, is I would say not as good as lightning because there's actually a decent bit of cold resistance, not a ton, but there are some. So I would say this is obviously S tier, and it's above force damage because of the vulnerabilities that you can set up. Force is less like there's less people that are resistant to force, but with cold damage you can double it. So that's obviously like a huge perk. And the nice thing is you can cast create water outside of combat. And if there's any invisible creatures, it'll make them turn visible again, and you can deal double damage. Cone of Cold, one of the best spells in the game because of that. Now, as for lightning damage, this is same story as Cold, doubled, but there's one enemy that you're going to be fighting a lot in Act 3 in the Steel Watch, and they are all resistant to they are all vulnerable to lightning damage. So you can literally just roll in there with Chain Lightnings, Call Lightning, Thunderbolt, Lightning Bolts, all your lightning attacks, and just take them out. It's definitely S tier and probably the best damage type in general because Chain Lightning's probably the best damage option. You can deal upwards of 160 damage. Now, if you have a cleric and you're able to set up 2 levels of cleric to get the Destructive Wrath, set up 1 level of wizard to scribe yourself the Chain Lightning spell, and then take the rest points in the sorcerer, you can do a quickened spell, and you can use Chain Lightning and use your reaction to make it make the maximum amount of damage. So it goes from being the 80 max damage to 160, and you can spread that to 3 other targets. With the cleric's channel divinity for the Tempest is it's able to do the maximum damage roll. So you can literally wipe out encounters with 1 spell, making it the best damage type overall. Next, I could talk all day about lightning and cold, but we got to move on. Fire damage. This is still a pretty good damage type because fire gets, I would say, the most items. Like there's a lot of items specific to poison, and like if you deal poison, you heal for X amount of health. Fire gets a lot of those too. You also get unique items like the Pyro Quickness Hat, where if you cast a fire spell, you burn yourself, but if you're like a tiefling, that's fine. And with the fire damage, you get an extra bonus action. So there's some builds that use fire damage to really great use. And while it's very resisted, it's probably the second most resisted damage type in the game after poison. There's a lot to like about fire damage. Fireball being one of the best spells just for pure damage. I would have to say fire's probably like, I want to say A tier because I like fire builds, but I might put it above thunder. There's a lot to say about it, but tieflings are resistant to it. There's fiends and cambions are all resistant to it. It just starts to kind of peter off in terms of its usage later in the game compared to some of the other types. You can't create a fire vulnerability, but if there's a target that's if you can use the arsonist oil to create a fire vulnerability if they're resistant to fire damage. So tieflings, you can use the arsonist oil and then you can deal double fire damage, but that's literally one of the only ways to do that. So yeah, psychic damage. This is a interesting one because there's a lot of Gith exclusive weapons that will deal extra psychic damage, and you might think that like mind flayers would be resistant to it, but they're actually not. They're just, you can damage them normally with it. Psychic damage doesn't have items like radiant, fire, and poison damage do. It's still a decent damage type though, just because there's not a lot of creatures that resist it. So I'm going to put in the A tier. It's kind of it's bland, I guess, but it's better than some of the other damage types. So that just makes it A tier, I would say. Next we got acid damage. Now acid damage has some creatures resist it. It's just not as common as like a fire resist. But acid damage, if you apply acid to the target, like if you throw an acid pod, you can reduce its armor class by 2, making it way easier to hit. So acid can be good if you couple it together with that, because most acid attacks like Melf's acid arrow are going to bring on that. So it could be somewhere's B tier to A tier. You're never really going to build around acid that much, but you can. So I guess I put it in A tier because the reducing the armor class by 2 is a really nice use. Not all spells will do that, but typically it's going to be coupled with that. So yeah. Necrotic damage. I wish this was better because there's a lot of ways to deal necrotic damage, but it's more so like there's cleric spells that you can deal either radiant or necrotic, and this is just for anything that will reflect radiant pretty much, because undead are resistant to it usually. Necrotic is like undead damage basically. I wish it was better because I really like a lot of necrotic damage spells. Like Circle of Death is a really cool spell, but I must say it's probably like a C tier because a lot of things resist it. We fight a lot of undead in this game, and they oftentimes resist that. So poison and necrotic are just not as good as I want them to be. I really like this damage type. Like I love necromancer builds. I think they're a whole lot of fun. They are better than physical damages, so it has that going. But getting into the physical damage, because there's some interesting ways you can make these a little bit better. So I guess starting off with slashing, this is the weakest of the 3. I would say slashing is probably another D tier because there's Blade Ward is extremely common in this game. There's a lot of resistance to overall physical damage. If you can turn this into a magical version, it's better obviously, but I do think piercing and bludgeoning do have a bit of an edge over it because this is just a very resisted damage type and it doesn't do anything extra. There's so many creatures that have resistance to all physical damage in this game, and like Blade Ward having physical damage makes this a weaker option. Now, piercing damage, I seen a lot of tier lists that put this at the D tier as well. I disagree. I think piercing damage could be S to A tier. The reason being, there is armor you can get in Act 3, the Ballast armor, which will create vulnerability to piercing damage. So if you have a double dagger build and you're going around sneaking and you have this armor on, they'll take double damage. So that's really good. Also, there's a dagger in Act 3. If you don't want to wear the armor, you can take this awesome dagger that deals a ton of damage, and it, on attack, will apply vulnerability to piercing damage. So if you have 2 daggers, stab them, vulnerable, they take double damage. And then your next attack, they're vulnerable. Or if you have a bow, you can shoot your bow. I think piercing damage is much better than people give it credit for, and you can even set up like piercing damage. You have an arrow of many targets. If you have a lot of creatures grouped together and you have like the crossbow expert perk, you can run in there and shoot them with the hand crossbow, and with the armor of the ballast armor, they're going to be having a weakness to it, taking double damage. So I could say piercing could be S tier, A tier. It's just the only issue is like if you don't have that armor, it's not as good, but I'm going to say it is an A tier damage type because you can apply a vulnerability for it, and that's what makes these so good, is being able to double your damage is extremely useful. Not to mention, if you can apply a vulnerability, if they have a resistance to it, they no longer have that resistance. The vulnerability overrides that. So I guess for that, I might even put it up here because it can just be a very powerful damage type overall. It depends what your build is, but I think it can be an S tier damage type. And then next we have Bludgeoning, which is another physical damage type, which means it has a lot of resistances. But early on in the game, this is actually a good damage type because a lot of the time we're fighting undead. This is the most common enemy type I feel like in Baldur's Gate is undead, and skeletons are weak to this. So we can, deal double damage with the hammer. Some of my favorite moments in this game is playing with friends and we go around bonking skeletons with our big hammers. And I think that that's a really fun thing to do. It is probably just C tier though because of the many resistances, but if you know when to bring out the bonk, it can be pretty decent. So it's C tier to B tier, somewhere around there. But yeah, my favorite damage types, I think the best to build around is if you have a team that has like a lightning user, so a Tempest Cleric, if you have a Storm Sorcerer that has like cold damage, if you have a Bard that has hand crossbows for piercing and can apply piercing weakness, and also has their level 10 magical secrets as Cone of Cold, that's really great synergy. And then bring along force damage to cover your other damage types because it's the least resisted. You can beat the whole game with a team made up of this. Like an Eldritch Blast Warlock, a Tempest Cleric, which has heavy armor, so it's pretty tanky and can heal. If you have a like Storm Sorcerer, and you can dip a level of Tempest Cleric as well, because it gets a reaction that's 2d8 of lightning damage, so that can also be doubled. I think that works great. 2 tanky classes. If you have a Bard, which is great for Song of Rest, and then yeah, your Warlock for short rest. That is a very powerful buildup of classes, and I think that this is a pretty decent damage tier list, but I'm always curious what you guys think. I might have overlooked some things, so feel free to leave a comment below with your thoughts on the damage types in Baldur's Gate 3. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.